morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. I know it's the early morning session, so we appreciate your dedication to biodiversity and nature. My name is Oliver Withers. I'm the Global Head of Biodiversity at Credit Suisse. So I have the very lucky job of working with colleagues across the firm to work out how we integrate biodiversity into our decision-making within our businesses, but also within our corporate functions. I'm happy to say biodiversity and nature has long been a very important topic for Credit Suisse. So next year will be the 10th Annual Conservation Finance Conference. I'm also delighted to say that this year, only last week, we published a report out of our Center for Sustainability focused on biodiversity. And we have a long track record of thought leadership in biodiversity. I just want to pick out one particular section, and I'm going to read this to you. Apologies, I'm going to read it straight from the page. This will provide some context for our discussion today. A 2021 survey by the Coalition for Private Investment in Conservation found that 70% of investors are planning to substantially increase investments in conservation in 2021 versus 2020. Similarly, project developers are also seeking more funding, aiming to raise 85% more for conservation projects in 2021 than they did in 2020. With the voluntary carbon market ramping up, nature-based solutions such as reforestation and afforestation projects now account for 45% of the total credits issued since 2019. 45% nature-based solutions. High-quality projects are also increasingly sought after due to a shift in demand preference from avoidance to removal credits and because of non-carbon benefits. In our conversations, biodiversity and nature-based solution investment opportunities in the context of voluntary carbon markets are among the most discussed topics this year. Market interest in biodiversity credits is at a high level. Similar in concept to carbon credits, which deliver a measurable and verifiable unit of carbon emissions avoided or removed from the atmosphere, a biodiversity credit would represent a unit of biodiversity that is protected or restored. From a project development perspective, there is a clear need to price in such differentiators as the voluntary carbon market today remains highly carbon-centric and does not reflect, at least on a comparable and consistent basis, non-carbon attributes such as social and biodiversity benefits. There is also increasing demand for nature-based investments from corporates as more and more companies are setting conservation targets along with emission goals and are focused on supply chain issues such as avoided deforestation. Complementary to a potentially $50 to $100 billion voluntary carbon market, a well-designed biodiversity credit scheme could potentially unlock significant private financing in conservation investments. So with this in mind, I'm delighted to be joined today by a number of panelists that represent a cross-section of a potential biodiversity credits market space. So we have project developers in the room, we have market makers in the room, and we have people that are trying to deploy capital into biodiversity and natural capital. I will hand over to my panelists shortly to introduce themselves. I would like to just manage expectations. We are not expecting to walk out of this session with solutions or biodiversity credits defined. The purpose of this conversation is to highlight the concept of biodiversity credits, how excited we are as practitioners in this field around this concept. But we would like to really get across this notion that the devil is in the detail. And as exciting as this market prospect is, we have to be very careful in building out this market so that it has the necessary governance and it has the necessary detail in the biodiversity credit methodology that can really allow this market to grow into the future. With that, I'm going to join my panel and hand over to them to start introducing themselves. So Gabby?
Yes, hi, thank you. Sitting next to you. My name is Gabriele Roselius. I'm the managing partner of Macoun International, a Swiss-based company, very small, still growing, hopefully, soon. We work in the field of restoring large-scale degraded mangrove habitats, and saltwater agriculture is also part of our specialization. Our concept is top-down. We work with governments in the Middle East and West Africa to get our plots NDC excluded. That's a requirement under the new ITMO rules of the Paris Accord for corresponding adjustments. That means that there's no double counting issue, because all forests are within the NDC. And we have to take the plots out of the NDC so we can sell carbon credits. That's our specialization.
Thanks very much, Gabby. Helge, over to you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Helge Mahner. I'm the Global Funding Director for African Parks. African Parks is a conservation organization focused on the African continent. Our vision is to provide a significant contribution to the 30 by 30 target on the African continent. We specialize on the management of protected areas, so legally protected areas, in partnership with governments and local communities. Today we manage 22 parks across 12 countries in Africa, totaling almost 21 million hectares. We employ around 5,000 people on the continent and are primarily funded by philanthropic donations and institutional development assistance. But we are very excited about possibilities now to engage in new ways of funding our activities, which is, among others, carbon, but also potentially a biodiversity or nature credit. And I'm going to talk about that more on the panel.
Thanks very much, Helge. Colin, over to you.
Thanks, Ollie, and thank you to Credit Suisse for inviting us here today, and good morning, everyone. Great to be here, to be chatting about this topic. It is very exciting. My name is Colin Porteous. I'm the Chief Investment Officer for Peacebox Foundation, and I was told by one of my panelists that I should really have not brought my Swiss banker suit, but brought my car keys, just to show that I am actually in the field. So Peacebox Foundation was started in 1997 by Nelson Mandela, Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, and Dr. Anton Rupert. And really the principle of Peacebox was large-scale landscape conservation, so creating cross-border conservation areas. And as we've grown, it was our 25-year anniversary this year. And as we've grown, we've moved from facilitating these treaties between governments to actually starting to implement protected area management with our partners on the ground, the governments and the communities, through co-management agreements. But fundamentally, we're an organization about conservation at scale. And that means connecting these protected areas together through corridors and connectivity interventions. So really, it's a complementary to what African Parks does. Conservation at scale is connecting these landscapes together. And, I came across almost 2 years ago now with the mandate to find new funding mechanisms for conservation, because like African Parks, Peacebox Foundation is primarily funded by donors and DFIs. And we've recognized, our board has recognized that there's this emerging market for nature finance. And one of those key topics on everyone's lips is biodiversity credits, and how do you monetize the value that you're delivering. So yeah, with that, thanks again for having me on the panel, and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Colin. Tanya, over to you.
Good morning. My name is Tanya Hoffman. I'm the co-founder and director of a company called Clamondial. It's a company that I set up in 2010. I've actually worked in the environmental finance space for about 20 years. Clamondial was set up to help mobilize more financing towards sustainable natural resource management, primarily in emerging markets, and we have a local presence in East and West Africa, which we're now expanding to Asia and Latin America. Within Club Mondial, we have two sides to our business. So we've worked over many years together with leading companies, foundations, and also some governments and investors. So, for example, we've worked with groups like Nespresso, FAO, and the Marine Stewardship Council on using their existing structures to mobilize more financing towards sustainable supply chain and sourcing programs. And we also create and implement new innovative funding solutions. So we created a fund called the Food Securities Fund, which I'm also director of, which is providing capital into sustainable sourcing landscapes. So we started last year. We've already funded 6 landscapes, reaching around 40,000 smallholder farmers on 50,000 hectares of land. And we're now working on another fund for longer-term financing in landscapes called the Biosphere Integrity Fund, which is supported by the US government, Rainforest Alliance, Conservation International, and the Carbon Disclosure Project.
Thanks very much, Tanya. And last but never least, Vienne.
Thanks so much, Oliver. And I just want to acknowledge the humility of being on a panel with these guys. These people remind me why I'm doing what I'm doing, where I'm doing it. I used to spend more time in conservation and more time in the field, and just remembering what African Parks has achieved, Peacebox have achieved, what you guys are doing is just very reassuring for me. So what I do is a number of things in the finance space. So having spent about 12 years in asset management, I then became head of sustainability at a $1.5 trillion wealth tech platform called FNZ Group, an investee company of generation investment management. I have always wanted to help mainstream nature into investment decision making. So as part of that, we created a dedicated nature metrics ESG data company. I'm also on the board of Nature Finance, and I am part of the task force for nature markets. And really the thread that connects all of these things is to mainstream nature into investment decision-making at scale, so that we can start to do the things that we've talked about here, create different funding mechanisms to protect our natural heritage, which is what we're all here to do.
Thanks very much, Vienne. So hopefully you will see that we have a very diverse audience here. So a representation, as I said, of project developers. Very important that we remind ourselves why we are doing this. So we are very lucky we've got 3 project developers here that are the ones that are actually operating at the proverbial coalface. And so what I'd like to do is just turn to them and almost take a step back before we get into biodiversity credits, and let's discuss carbon credits. I think there's been a lot of excitement about the carbon markets and the potential that they have for catalyzing funding for biodiversity and conservation. However, I think it's important that we actually speak to the people that are trying to implement these projects on the ground, and let's hear from them their experience with the carbon markets. So, Colin, let's start with you. I mean, what is Peacebox doing in the carbon markets?
Carbon is a very interesting space and a very active space, and it went through a slump for almost a decade, since 2008, 2009, due to the integrity question. And it's a very it's a sad reflection of market failure, and having a high quality carbon standard has proved vital. So with that, you've gone through this evolution of voluntary carbon where you do a methodology, but you now need to layer over the top of it biodiversity and community standards to show that there's actual engagement and delivery on the ground, and it's not just a project that someone has slapped together and started selling. So we work in various categories of carbon. So Red Plus in Mozambique and Zambia, which is really avoided deforestation. and it's large-scale landscapes. The project that we're seeking in Zambia is around about 3.6 million hectares in total, scaling small and growing. And then in Mozambique, we're targeting around about 2.5 million hectares. So it's a large-scale landscape intervention. And it is a very, very effective mechanism for protection, but it has to be done in a very credible and collaborative manner. You need the stewards of the land to buy into this first and foremost, and then you need the government structures to buy into it and understand the value for not only the communities and their natural capital assets, but also for their sovereignty. So REDD+ as a mechanism is an interesting one. It's got its challenges due to scale, but it is a very exciting delivery mechanism of conservation. Then on top of that, we're looking at some blue carbon projects in Maputo National Park, which is one of our co-managed reserves in Mozambique. Mangrove, seagrasses, that type of work. And interestingly, there's a growing flavor of biodiversity in the blue carbon space. And then the third component where we're working is on, let's call it project delivery, so efficient cook stoves, so the use of, let's call it technology to reduce the impact on feedstocks from local forests, etc. So that actually is about to be, our first pilot of 10,000 cook stoves is about to be verified, and the first cash flows into the community in Q1 next year. So yes, it's very active space, and I think the exciting part is the projects, as they are moving towards a more holistic intervention. Like I said, it's layering on the biodiversity and social on top of it, and I think that's becoming more and more important in the carbon markets.
Thanks, Colin. Helga, I'm going to turn to you. I mean, we're going to park the blue carbon because we're going to pick that up with Gabby, but let's turn to Helga now. What has African Parks' experience been in the carbon markets to date?
So, I mean, first of all, for an organization like African Parks, the possibility to actually sell carbon credits for specific parks is extremely welcome and a tremendously exciting opportunity, because it just creates a different source of funding for our activities. And I'll give you an example. We have a park in Eastern Central African Republic. That's one of the areas on the earth that's still literally intact and a real wilderness. That, from a traditional conservation commercial development perspective, we call this a Category 3 park, because neither in the long term it will likely never be financially sustainable. It will always be dependent on input, and carbon could completely revolutionize that and actually turn this park into a profitable business, and allow us to basically continue our operations, as well as channel quite significant amount of resources into the communities around it. So that's a really fantastic tool for us. But and we're gonna obviously move on that opportunity across our portfolio where it is possible. So we have around 5 projects under development in the pipeline and REDD+ avoidance credits. But then it is not a solution for an organization like ours in the long term, because first of all, it only captures carbon, so it's only it doesn't capture the entire palette of ecosystem services that intact and pristine nature delivers to the society and the global economy. And second, there are fundamental flaws in this system, especially around sort of avoidance versus removals. When we do our work right, we usually reduce the pressure on the natural resources that we manage. And that would actually penalize us in the longer term in terms of receiving credits. So there's a little bit of a perverse incentive here, which needs to be fixed if carbon is to become a long-term funding tool for protecting nature and basically contributing to the 30 by 30 target over time. I'll stop here and we get into nature and biodiversity afterwards, I guess. Yeah.
Thanks, Helga. I mean, you bring up a really important point, though, which is this acknowledgement that under net zero, avoided deforestation credits are not going to be included, which means we essentially have two voluntary markets, one which is going to see significant demand because it's related to net zero, and the other which unfortunately is not looking that robust. And as you say, it is a key point that the market needs to address, and perhaps biodiversity credits are a mechanism for doing that. Before we get into biodiversity credits, I want to turn to Gabby and pick up on the blue carbon point that Colin made, because Gabby, you are in the blue carbon space.
Yes, that's correct. We restore ecosystems for permanence. So it's not an agroforestry model we pursue. So we don't have an underlying business where we make business. An ecosystem usually doesn't do any business. It's just there. And there are indirect benefits, biodiversity enhancing and better soil, tsunami protection, and so on and so on. Clean water. There's so many benefits linked to ecosystems in general. So we rely 100% on a carbon model. And as the carbon price is skyrocketing from our point of view, even restoring ecosystems turned into a business model now. And so we came from the compliance market, and we were put with the last COP in Glasgow in the voluntary market, where we are very unhappy about that because it ruined the carbon price a bit. But also there, the good quality projects, which are defined by additionality. So it's not an existing forest, it's a new forest, defined by a third-party certifier, so everything gets verified, scientifically verified on evidence. So we took that road. It's expensive and it's taking its time, but we believe it's worth it because all impacts on the environment and on the biodiversity are proven. And so it's a high-end road, but our plots are very large. The new projects we are fundraising now, it's 34,000 hectares. So it's worth the pain, I would say, and the game. And so we are 100% a carbon model. So we don't need the biodiversity or soil credits, as we can't use them anyway, because all the benefits are for the locals. In that region, they stay in the country, and we cannot sell credits on those elements, or this wouldn't work in our model. So the extra fish which will come are for the fishermen to support the project, because we have to buy in all stakeholders. They're usually poor communities, and they get poorer because of the depletion of fish and food and the desertification of the landscapes. So we're returning that, and as ecology leads to wealth, that is an element we have to keep for the locals. So we are not using these elements. So this is not our concept. So we are 100% carbon. And as everything, as I said, as NDC excluded, there's also no double counting, because these are new forests. They have not been there. It's on really destroyed ecosystems. It's just desert now, and we're returning this and back to hopefully greenery soon.
Thanks, Gabby. And I mean, I'm going to pick up on this point that you've made around, whilst you might not be in a position to sell biodiversity credits, it's very clear that the biodiversity value is there. And that value is for those local communities, which to me in and of itself is somewhat of a biodiversity credit. I'm going to turn now to Tanya, because I think we've had the benefit of hearing from project developers. I'd like to switch to Tanya now and talk about the investor sentiment around this concept. A lot of talk about biodiversity credits. You are actually dealing with investors, people who are trying to allocate capital into this market or into nature more broadly. I mean, do you think that biodiversity credits are bankable? I mean, are you even seeing demand or interest from investors on this topic?
I think on the topic of biodiversity, certainly. I think on the topic of biodiversity offsets, TBD. So I can speak from two perspectives. So on the one hand, I mean, we've been working with a large Swiss consumer-facing goods company for the past couple of years, running their RFP processes for buying high-quality carbon credits, and now also supporting them on making insetting investments. So there I can say, I mean, obviously there's the intention to pay a little bit extra for projects that have high benefits, but I think increasingly what we're seeing also from other large corporates that we're dealing with is that there's a kind of renewed focus on looking at internalizing some of those own costs within their supply chain. So on moving towards things like insetting. So this company, for example, is and we're supporting them on this, is making a multi-million-dollar investment in South America and restoring a forest area that's kind of close to where they are doing sourcing and processing. And there I think that they are definitely incorporating biodiversity within that investment strategy, but not necessarily buying biodiversity offsets. So I think, you know, layering on these kind of quality attributes is important. I'm not sure that's necessarily separate. Similarly, in the investments that the Food Securities Fund is doing, we are supporting companies on their freeing up their equity financing for also things like conservation activities. One company that we did finance, and we are financing, is actually also involved in the Payments for Ecosystem Services program. So they're in the cocoa sector, and they're, because of their clients, again, leading consumer-facing goods companies, asking them to reduce their footprints. You know, they are setting up these models, but it's not necessarily it's not a REDD+ project, but they see that it's important for them to actually maintain, as it has an important business perspective. So, and I think also it's important to say, I was in the clean development mechanism in the first, even before the voluntary carbon markets, and then I also worked in the voluntary carbon markets, and I was involved in some of the first guidance under the VCS for agriculture, forestry, and other land use. So I've seen this market evolve over the last sort of 15 years plus. And I think it's important to think about, you know, why are we wanting to do biodiversity credits? You know, what is the credit? What is the unit? You know, who's going to buy it? I think it can be financed if there is demand that is sort of bankable, and if the transaction costs are not too high.
Thanks, Tanya. And that's a perfect segue, Vienne, to you, because I think Tanya's touched on this point that we need a kind of market governance, we need proper frameworks in place. You're obviously involved in a few initiatives that are looking at this, not least of which is the Task Force on Nature Markets. I mean, we are starting to hear a lot about this term nature positive, and nature positive being potentially a driver for biodiversity credits. Can you just share with the audience, what is nature positive conceptually?
Absolutely. And I'll also highlight the brilliant work of two of my colleagues in the room. So Jeremy Apple on the alignment side, working within nature finance, so really highlighting that work, and also Robin's work for the Task Force for Nature Markets, the report that was put out valuing markets at around $7 trillion, nature markets. Therefore, we need to think about how we govern those. So just 2 points to share with you. The first is regulation around disclosure for finance institutions is mandating that biodiversity risks be disclosed. So my view is that we're going to start to see a real surge in demand and interest for biodiversity credits, because the EU SFDR, really annoying piece of detail for you, but it's called Principal Adverse Impact number 7, asks companies who are investing in companies to report on whether they are having a negative impact on biodiversity for every investee company, and that's going to come into force next year. There are other regulations like Article 29 in France doing a similar thing. Institutions who have signed up to the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge, these disclosures are all going to come out next year, which means that biodiversity risk will be identified in some way and risk will start to be priced, which means that probably you're going to start to get a real surge in interest for biodiversity credits. So Yes, there will be demand, in my view, which means governance is absolutely critical, because how does one offset one's impact? If you know what your impact is, which then takes us into this definition of what is nature positive. The reason this is an important super year for biodiversity is because we're moving into the next 3 months where we have the Convention on Biodiversity, which is going to define for the next 20 or so years the parameters of what our targets should be as a global ecosystem. Part of that is the definition of net zero. It's called net zero for nature, nature positive. We'll start to see a definition of that come out from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature in October. That will feed into the process for the CBD in December and feed through into what nature alignment is, which comes back to what the institutions are going to be doing. Most financial institutions do not get up every day thinking about how they manage their impact on nature. It's just life. They're there to serve their clients, their fiduciaries. So the concept of nature positive is aiming to define, if you understand your risk in your portfolio, which is, as we've said, going to start to come to the fore next year, what do you do about it? So the alignment work, which is coming out, will say, right, if this is what your risk is, this is how you identify it, this is how you might measure it, and this is how you might take action, whether you buy credits, how you assess those, whether they're verified. That is the important work that any governance structure has to get its arms around as this market starts to grow. How do you actually match the governance you need in a $7 trillion market to the stage it's at and the demand that I think we're going to see? That's what the Task Force for Nature Markets is aiming to solve.
Thanks very much, Vienne. That was really interesting. Tanya.
Yeah, I mean, I think like biodiversity offsets is not something new. I don't know if those of you that, I mean, for example, the Forest Trends has been working on this model together with Shell under a program called BBOP from 2008 to 2014. Governments, for example, in Colombia, in the US, have done species banking, have done wetland mitigation banking. So I mean, like in some places, this is already like a legal regulation to do that, to compensate if you are building, for example, infrastructure or whatever. I think, you know, we are, the Food Securities Fund is an Article 9 fund in the SFDR. We have investors, for example, the ASN Biodiversity Fund, that invest in the fund for kind of biodiversity impact, and the fund also has investment from the Global Environment Facility, representing the UNCBD and the UNFCCC, but I'm not sure that I necessarily see space for like a global biodiversity offset market. I think that, you know, just looking at the actual underlying data and the kind of geographic specificities, I can't speak, sorry, the specifics of each specific place or country and what actually biodiversity means in those places is still to be defined by many governments. I mean, if you look at the national strategy action plans on the CBD that the governments have put in place, I mean, there are huge information gaps. So I think setting up a biodiversity offsets market in some of these places would probably be irresponsible, to be honest. But I think that there's a lot of pressure to include biodiversity, but I'm just, you know, I have problems with having a global biodiversity offsets market at this point.
So thanks, Tanya. And I'm going to jump back to you, Vienne, and pick up, I think, on this distinction between the term biodiversity and nature, right? So we've got a task force on nature-related financial disclosures. We are theoretically, conceptually discussing biodiversity credits here. What is the distinction between nature and biodiversity, and should we actually be talking about nature credits instead of biodiversity credits?
That's a great question. So biodiversity being defined as the diversity of species on Earth and how they interact. And if we look at something like the Task Force for Nature-related Disclosures, and we look at the science-based targets for for nature definitions, what we're looking at is biodiversity as one subset of a number of different elements, whether that be water, soil, the actors on nature in general, climate change, pollution. So yes, biodiversity can be seen as one category. Should we be looking at broad nature? Yes, it's challenging to do. I think that the regulatory focus in nature markets, in nature the evolution of nature markets is really focusing and moving finance towards biodiversity specifically, difficult though that is to measure.
Thanks, Vienne. I mean, so I'm going to stick with this topic of nature versus biodiversity. I'm going to turn to the project developers, because you guys have alluded to the fact that you are delivering so much more than just carbon, and actually so much more than just biodiversity. So Helga, let's start with you. I mean, what's your take on nature credits versus biodiversity credits?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I definitely tend towards the nature credits, because again, biodiversity is one facet of basically the services that pristine nature delivers. The problem is the complexity of nature. Huh? It's really, I mean, I don't know anybody who could put really the finger on, you know, this is nature, and say, you know, this is how biodiversity interacts with the soil, with the clean air, with the water, etc. So, but there is a way to, I think, for us to value pristine nature, and if you look at different spaces on Earth, describe what that nature is made of. So in that sense, my feeling is we should definitely go towards a nature credit, of which biodiversity is one of the key outcomes that you would look at in order to define whether the nature, at what stage is it, whether it's pristine, whether you're safeguarding that pristine nature, whether it's degraded and you basically moving towards a more a more regenerated nature to some extent.
Thanks, Helga. And Gabby, your take?
Yes, thank you. As you said, nature has a value, and pollution should be priced, and in my view, taxed. Because I think we should not use the offsetting to misuse this as a license to keep on polluting and not doing the real work of cutting ongoing emissions. And I think biodiversity and soil improvement, especially from the agriculture industry and forestry, it should be done over the regulatory issue. It should be defined by our politicians via laws and regulations, in my point of view. I don't know. For our model and our business model we do as a project developer, the biodiversity effects puts us into a higher carbon category. If we talk about nature-based solutions in general, the agroforestry models, the price is about $6 is varying. It can be as low as 30 cents. That depends, but our project is priced right now at $55 US. So it's worth investing. It's carbon as a new commodity. As the nature got a price tag, and also polluting gets a price tag, we believe that this investment is a good business model for the future. So that's our case, how we do. But we are different from agroforestry, and I think the problem is to incentivize farmers to change their way of practice. If there are no regulations, then I think biodiversity credits might be a solution if the standards are set, and if there are certain methodologies developed to compare these effects they produce on a worldwide basis. But right now I think that's still very difficult, because they're so it's difficult also to measure and to monitor what farmers then do. So there's the fear of impact washing too.
That's a very important point, and we'll pick that up in a bit. I also think a very important point that you made is this nexus with policy and regulation. you know, the degree to which we as a collective, the broad collective interested in this market, want to build a market versus the degree to which policy and regulation should be creating the market to a certain extent as well. So, Colin, turning to you, I mean, for Peacebox, what's the take on nature versus biodiversity?
Yeah, it's such an important question, and you know, I think I broadly agree here, because fundamentally you've got natural capital, which is made up of various classes, one of which is a subset biodiversity. But then you have the abiotic factors, soil, water, and the way it interacts generates a value. And it's very difficult to trace back ultimately that value to the subset. And the analogy I like to think about is, it's like an airplane. You are going to have manufacturers who manufacture engines. Some build wings, some build seats, some build, you know, cockpits. But you've got to put them together before you can fly. So there's actually accounting standards in place when you are doing accounting of some of the parts, right? So you can add up the value of all your parts, and that's how you account for it. But it doesn't give you the value of what the plane is. So my view is the biodiversity on its own is like having an engine made, but the plane's not going to fly without wings. So you've got to have a stacked, a layered approach to biodiversity and nature. And I think that talks to Tanya's point on you know, is the world ready for a nature market? You know, we had a discussion last night. The way that you sell a plane is on a project basis. You know, there's only a few people out there who are going to buy a plane and then commercially fly it. And I think this is almost a project finance type structure with nature markets at the moment, whereas carbon is sophisticated enough to almost be a commodity trade. What it is a commodity trade. Are we going to reach that point with biodiversity? It's a great question, and I think to Helga's point, it's a hugely complex beast to actually understand and put value on. And the metrics for biodiversity credits in Nestle's supply chain versus a precision agriculture business in Australia versus conservation in Chinko National Park are fundamentally different pieces of this airplane, right? Those are seats and engines and wings there. So I'm personally of the view that I think we'll see a nature market and a nature credit, or credit might be a stretch, but there's going to be a product for nature. Will we get to a traded market, to coin a phrase, TBD?
Thanks very much, Colin. So, Tanya, I'm going to turn to you now. I mean, your investors, your clients, are they talking about biodiversity? Or are they talking about nature more broadly? Do they make the distinction between the two?
Yeah, so we do have investors. For example, ASN Impact Investors in the Netherlands have a biodiversity fund. So there, you know, we have agreed reporting that we do to them, and then also the Global Environment Facility is also an investor in the Food Securities Fund, and there we did develop, you know, KPIs and targets and a measurement framework linked to the UN CBD, the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, and to climate change. That was approved by those organizations. But, you know, this is a fund for global emerging and developing markets across landscapes from oilseeds production in arid West Africa to cocoa production landscapes, to coffee, to spices, to other types of grains. So just kind of trying to put that all into one specific, I mean, you can have KPIs like, you know, numbers of hectares under sustainable agricultural practices, be that, you know, Rainforest Alliance or organic or other types of climate smart agriculture practices that have been defined by the government. You know, we can train farmers on things, but like, what does that actually mean in practice? You know, I think also there is a big space for qualitative information still in those things. So I think that makes it difficult to have something that is a tradable credit. And I think that also undermines actually a lot of the value that you can have in these kind of places. The other thing, just also to Colin's point, I mean, we have also done investment assessments of several nature-based solution investments. So I definitely think there's huge untapped economic value in many of these places. I think the question is, how do you structure this to actually make it investable? And there, I think also some of the work that Credit Suisse has done around, debt for nature swaps, I think this is the kind of thing that we really need, and more blended finance things on probably more of a project finance basis. Maybe also capturing local regulations, like for example there is in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Costa Rica, in Vietnam, to try to make some of these things actually investable.
Thanks, Tanya. And I mean, I think a great point you've made, again, reinforcing this idea that there's local policy and regulation that is actually driving some of these market dynamics for biodiversity credits or nature credits as well. Also, you touched on this idea of measurement, and I want to pick up on that. I particularly enjoyed your comments around there is still room for qualitative reporting. I think that we're all quite obsessed with coming up with a beautiful methodology that will capture everything. Clearly, there's still a value on qualitative. But when we talk about metrics and quantitative approaches, what is it that, in your experience, investors actually want to see? And what, to Colin's point that he made, what do we need to get in place from a methodology perspective to address greenwashing risk?
I think what they want to see, first of all, is materiality to an investment case. So that there is actually something that someone will pay for at the end of the day, be it consumers willing to pay in premium that is within products. So for example, Marine Stewardship Council products, we've created a spin out with the support of the MAVA Foundation into something called the Ocean Stewardship Fund, where actually part of the MSC's revenues will go into actually providing pre-financing and support for fisheries in emerging developing countries. So there we see consumers even potentially willing to pay for that additional support provided through the label. And similarly, the Forest Stewardship Council has also created a basis for layering on top claims on top of the existing FSC certification. So they also audit things like biodiversity or contribution to ecosystem services that then, consumers will pay extra for. And then I think the other thing is just on the transaction cost side. And I think this is an unfortunate situation where we probably still need blended finance. I mean, we need to obviously make sure that the measurement and reporting framework is robust. But then I think the challenge has also been with some of the, I think, more niche and potentially interesting community-based carbon credit projects is that, the cost to actually meeting some of these standards becomes very high and makes the projects uneconomical. So I think, that's the balance. And obviously we should be doing the best we can, but I think it's also, recognizing this is an evolving space, and we need to work with maybe project developers or implementers that have a history of actually wanting to do things properly rather than speculators. So I think that's great, the types of people that are here today. But I think in terms of greenwashing, I think, get technical support, do due diligence, work with people that have the right motivations on the projects that they're doing. And then obviously the two other points I mentioned around demand and transaction costs.
Amazing, thank you, Tanya. And I mean, we're going to park that transaction cost because I'm going to come back to the project developers on this, because you guys are having to deal with this already in the carbon markets. But I'm going to turn to Vienne. I mean, Vienne, again, you're involved in several initiatives that are looking at kind of the market level to this. How far away from some sort of methodology do you think we are?
I think to reinforce the points that many of my fellow panelists have made, there are very different approaches one can use, qualitative, quantitative. Technology is now available to measure change in some respects using either geospatial information, satellite data, understanding reports from on the ground in terms of how things are changing. So these bioacoustics, it's extraordinary how the space has changed. I remember we collared elephants in Virunga National Park in 2015, and we had to dart them and put collars on them to do that. Now, there are other ways of doing that. Bioacoustics just wasn't there at that time. So the rise in technology to monitor is astonishing. There are incredible people working in this field. Look at the NOAA Data Alliance, for example, to see some of the people who are doing this work. However, at a level where you're catering to financial institutions who are trying to measure their impact at scale, really what we have is the science behind this, whether it's data coming out of Encore, whether it's data coming out of science-based targets, whether it's data which is being provided by the likes of IBAT, IUCN, and UNWCMC, and other emerging technologies, eDNA, etc. Really, where we start there, if you're monitoring a portfolio of thousands of companies, is with a screen based on those sector-specific pieces of information, and importantly, what the company's doing. So reputational risk, understanding whether companies are involved in any illegality in their supply chains, it has to be a multifaceted approach. So my view is that to your point, the different use cases demand different methodologies, and they are evolving, but I would expect technology to support that evolution over time.
Thanks, Vienne. And I mean, music to my ears hearing, that narrative of different use cases demand different methodologies. I think picking up on a point that Tanya made, this concept that we can't necessarily let perfect be the enemy of good or progress here. And I always like to compare it to depreciation on software. I mean, we have standard rules around how we depreciate the value of software. I mean, we have just made that up, and we've got comfortable with it. So it does seem like there's an opportunity for us to just put a stake in the ground, acknowledging, to Tanya's point, that this will continue to evolve. But I want to turn to the project developers now on the topic that Tanya raised around monitoring costs, right? I think there is an obsession with making sure that there is not greenwashing occurring, but that is very often coming at the expense of actually being able to deploy funding into conservation itself. Gabby, let's start with you. What's your experience on this?
Yes, we work with a foundation called For Lions, and to get our numbers right and the project right, so we can enter the certification process with Gold Standard. And it's a very strict standard, and it has a complex rule book in order to scientifically prove the evidence on our bio and eco impacts. So this is costly. It's a lot of number crunching, but as our plots are that large, it is not a huge burden, so we can carry that burden. And the extra value that Gold Standard is creating us is the upside in the carbon price. So at the end, it's worth taking the pain, I would say, for the better carbon price we can achieve on the market. And also the benefits what we get from that extra costs is that we a real removal certificate, which has probably a great future outlook in terms of being back in the compliance market. If we are back in the compliance market, our carbon price will double, and we are more tradable, because there's a stock exchange, the ETS, and that would be very helpful also for the monetization issues of our carbon credits. When we come to cost, the standard of Gold Standard requires that we get re-evaluated every 5 years. So they come on site, they visit the plots, they have a look at the biomass, they measure if the carbon stock and sinks are still in place, and usually the forest will hopefully get more dense. We get more carbon credits, so we are looking forward to their visits because it reflects on our return. So that will be done every 5 years. I mean, you have to have a certain plot size, otherwise it's really expensive. I agree that for smaller plots, this is probably a too high cost factor. there are the voluntary standards for self-assessment from ICUN, which is doing a great job. So maybe there are cheaper methods around, but still they also require a certain baseline. And the baselines have to be developed. The baselines for the carbon effects, the baselines for the biodiversity effects. And I think if there are no baselines around, you have a cost, because you have to develop the baselines with the scientific community. So there's a certain cost involved if you do the impact right.
Thanks, Gabby. Really important point that you've made around how necessary it is for scale. And whilst that's great for people that can operate at scale, it also does mean that we're ultimately excluding some smaller projects that are protecting critical biodiversity. I'm going to turn to Colin now. I mean, Peacebox, you're a conservation organization, you're already measuring biodiversity to a certain degree. I mean, how are you guys looking at, the potential of a biodiversity or nature credit market, and do you think that's going to be increased monitoring costs for you guys?
Yes, so stepping back from carbon and maybe just focusing on impact delivery with biodiversity as the focus here. Our interventions on natural capital ultimately lead to various categories of impact: biodiversity, climate change adaptation, mitigation, fragility, conflict and violence, sustainable livelihoods. It's a laundry list. We typically, like AP, have a donor-funded model, which we are trying to move into a commercial-facing product offering. The donors have various requirements in what they are seeking as impact. So they would be seeking maybe a rewilding or biodiversity outcome. They would community livelihoods, access to water, sustainable agriculture. So there are log frames that each of these projects will have to have, and there's certain activities that lead to outcomes, that lead to impacts. This is no different. Right, this is taking a donor hat off and putting it onto a commercial hat, and this, I think, is the critical point here. Is we are now at the point where risk compression is such that the 50-year climate problem and biodiversity problem in the 70s, when you drilled an oil well, is now 10 years away, and that is now within your funding tenor. So there is a direct causal link between investors and their risks and their income statement. So the importance, the approach that Peacebox is taking is basically trying to make the causal link between our activities and someone's income statement and balance sheet. So there's direct cash flow implications. So certain areas around our conserved areas would have direct issues with water quality, water access, dust, storms, etc. So physical risks. But you can actually make an indirect causal link to a business operating in Switzerland having quality of air, having access to the option value of biodiversity. So that basically says there are many different impacts that we need to measure. So how does Peacebox deal with this problem where it might be in the future hundreds of customers in the commercial market, basically all seeking maybe slightly different impacts? So how we've approached it is to create a cross-cutting monitoring, evaluation and learning system which generates data on a consolidated basis, and that is linked to a internally built API where we can cut and slice and dice the impact into a menu such that the investors now have direct causal link. So cause and effect on what their investment is going to deliver to them, bottom line, cash flow. It's very difficult to make that link because they are generally quite changeable, risky. If it is quite binary, if a risk occurs, there's a massive loss, but the chance of it occurring is potentially low. So it's very difficult to price it in. I think that is why the market has struggled with putting a valuation on biodiversity. I mean, you mentioned the regulatory requirements. The European Central Bank brought out supervisory regulations, as you know, last year. to say you need to price in climate and now nature risk. And everyone threw up their hands and said, well, how do we price nature risk? And this is precisely the issue that we're grappling with. So Peacebox really is just trying to make a very credible data set, and that data set is transparent and accessible to anyone who's interested in investing. That comes with a cost. And the more you measure, the more expensive it gets. And you can go ad nauseum into the detail of biodiversity. And if you wanted to know the population of a specific beetle in Limpopo National Park over 1 million hectares, you could spend $10 million doing that. Not practical, right? So, and it's not really going to generate a financial return for Peacebox, and we need to be practical about that implementation. So it comes back to the point of, is this a project finance or a market? Because I'm much easier able to go to a project financier and say, okay guys, we're going to deliver these impacts and this is what I want from you. And I'll say to them, you know, that's all well and good, but I've got project guys on the ground. They are at full capacity. They're drilling boreholes. They're putting fences. They're doing anti-poaching. There's no ways they can go and take 5,000 samples every month. It's just impossible. So let's get real here, guys. What's practical? And then we get to practical implementation, and you can deliver it. And I think that practical implementation does not talk to the regulatory requirements at the moment. There's this huge disconnect. And you can have all the best regulations in place, but guys will find their way around it. So you've got to go back and look at who is doing implementation properly. And the only way you can understand if someone is doing implementation properly is you look at their data. Is it actually credible? Do I believe it? Is there trust in what you're doing? And again, it comes down to the integrity of what's worked. And I've seen a number of people come with these absolutely absurd proposals, and they've got this very fancy, sophisticated blockchain delivery, blah, blah, blah. But you actually say, what are you doing? Oh, no, we'll talk about that later. And that's fundamentally where the trust issue comes in. So, yeah, it is a big challenge for Peacebox. We are applying a lot of capacity and funding into measurement because we believe that is the future of how you fund biodiversity on a global scale.
Thanks, Colin. I mean, I think that point about it being practical is absolutely critical. Helga, I'm going to turn to you. I mean, presumably a similar mindset from African Parks on this?
Yeah, I think, I mean, we measure, obviously, biodiversity today, and I think so do our peers. What we need to be cognizant of is currently we're measuring it for our own sake, so for improving our operations. It's not necessarily for proving an outcome to somebody else. And we do report to our donors, of course, and there are, as Colin mentioned, you know, different sets of interests, and to some extent you can really get lost and need to have sort of a sort of standard for yourself where you say, this is what we promise you and this is how we report on our activities. But that's still very far away from getting to a remotely or, you know, third-party auditable set of data that then basically delivers, you know, or underwrites an outcomes-based funding mechanism. And I think what's important to highlight here is that yes, we may want to get to a market at some point, which, you know, is standardized and regulated, and there's full confidence in governance. But there's a long way to go there. And right now we're working a lot on the theory of how that standard could look like. And in the meantime, we're not investing into actually checking, you know, how can we move from what conservation organizations measure today towards an outcomes-based, really focusing on the impact, really understanding the link between outcomes and impact, and the cost effectiveness of their operations in achieving these outcomes. Those are the first sort of steps that we need to make to ultimately then be able to create a joint standard mechanism that, you know, can sort of serve a market. So I would really highlight the importance of not forgetting the investment into these initial steps, and not, otherwise you have your beautiful standard, but it's not practical, so.
Yeah, I think you're highlighting for me that two things. One, this disconnect in terms of it's still going to take time for a nature market to arrive, and we need funding today for conservation, right? We can't necessarily wait for a nature market. And two, this idea that we've got to make sure that whatever nature market is built is actually consulting with the project developers who are actually having to deal with very context-specific challenges in terms of monitoring. And I think this concept that's popped out in this discussion around project finance versus a nature market is really, really important. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to turn to our audience now and ask if anyone has any questions for our panelists. Can we start at the front here? I think somebody will bring you a microphone, hopefully.
Hi, my name is Michael. I've been in space for more than 15 years. We've been tasked by the UNFCCC and the Coalition for Rainforest Nations to figure out how to scale REDD+ credits with the capital markets. So we're going to come up with a new product that's coming out next week with several global investment banks on how to scale REDD+ credits. So I just want to clarify a few points and then ask a few questions, because there's a lot of stuff that's been said on the panel, okay? So point number one, biodiversity credit. Just a point of clarification, biodiversity is life, okay? It's as purely as that. Oliver, I don't know if you realize, but you've put forest as a picture there, yeah? Without that forest, without the rainforest, there's no biodiversity. Therefore, you have to protect the forest first. Therefore, hence the carbon credit. Yeah? And then you can go into biodiversity credits. However, in the REDD+ mechanism, biodiversity is included in the REDD+ mechanism. So the notion of adding a biodiversity credit on top of a REDD+ credit when Papua New Guinea has implemented 14 national laws and CBD and all these conventions is a bit kind of moot. My second point is this. I haven't heard anybody talk about the Paris Agreement and Article 6. So my question is, how are you planning to net your projects and the wonderful stuff that you're doing within the country's NDC, and how are you contributing in a compliant way to the country's NDC and to the Paris Agreement? And my third point is moratoriums. As you probably know, lots of countries have implemented moratoriums because they understand that this carbon belongs to them, and not, unfortunately, to a voluntary project developer. So that's why Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, the Bahamas, I can go on. And guess what? At COP27, a lot more countries are going to implement moratoriums on voluntary carbon credits. So sorry to take up the time. I hope it made sense, my questions, and I'm happy to have a further discussion.
Absolutely. So I'm going to turn to the project developers to address the questions around the NDCs, right? And I can see Tanya has something to say. I think just from our perspective, just to clarify, as we started the session, we are certainly not suggesting that biodiversity credits are the solution. Our discussion point today is pretty much a lot of the points that you've made. Is there a need for biodiversity credits? Should it be biodiversity? Should it be broader nature credits that might include carbon and biodiversity, and dare I say, local indigenous communities as well? So I think for us, the perspective here is, yes, this is potentially very exciting, but there is a lot going on already. Is this just duplication of existing efforts? But let me turn immediately to Tanya, because I could see you had a particular point to make.
Yeah, hi Michael. Good to see someone that's also been in the space for a long time. So I think I agree with your concern. I think that is a big concern. I think we've also seen some governments actually pull out of historic World Bank FCPF programs because they see the opportunity in this space. We have been speaking to some governments around Article 6 transactions and ITMOs. I think the challenge is like who takes the implementation risk of those kind of things. If there's a demand, hopefully you can get financing through, but like TBD, and there also seems to be quite a lot of like different systems that are emerging from, you know, the old jurisdictional programs to voluntary jurisdictional programs to LEAF with arteries, and then now to Red Dot Plus, and then like other types of things that may emerge in the future. So it's a very kind of complicated space also for governments. And like speaking to some governments, they're also like, well, we don't know, like, you know, should we parcel out this piece for voluntary carbon markets? Should we do some bilateral deals? Should we set up a local market for like energy for carbon? So I think a lot of governments are also rightfully very nervous about this situation. In the new fund that we're putting together, the Biodiversity Integrity Fund, you know, we want to leave it open for financing insets, for financing potentially ITMOs or Article 6 transactions as part of that. But, you know, we want to keep it relatively open because, as you say, I think it's a bit of an open question at the moment. I think the other thing on the voluntary carbon markets, I mean, I think the most recent guidance I saw from BCMI is that those private-to-private transactions are not necessarily requiring corresponding adjustments. So I think that that's kind of becoming a segmented market, but, you know, with things like, you know, evolution in the European non-financial reporting directive and all those kind of things, I wonder how that will play out in the long term. So I think you're right to ask that question. I think it is a point of concern.
Absolutely, and I mean, I think the complexity, Michael, that you've just articulated and that Tanya's articulated is where we're looking at biodiversity credits saying, well, if this is the complexity in carbon, what is that going to look like in biodiversity? Are we ready for it? Gabby, I'm going to turn to you because you touched on this element earlier.
Yes, as we aim to be a real removal certificate for the compliance market, that's actually our aim. We are right now in the Wild West show of the voluntary market, very unhappy about this. We know that we have to comply with the Paris Accord, and Article 6 is one of the key elements, and the ITMO rules for corresponding adjustments, and that we can export the carbon credits. So they are not accounted to the country where we have our plots. They have to really confirm that. That's why our discussions with the government take so long. It's a negotiation between all ministries and their specific interests. So they all agree that this will be excluded to the NDC. Why would they exclude that? They exclude that either they can't pay for it because the reforestation is expensive, and they would like to invest their money in other projects. As we are very much active in Islamic oil-producing countries, they are busy with their oil industry. So all their net zero efforts are more the oil business focus, and they never valued nature so much, as also nature is not so, I would not say present, it's present, but it's different. It's more desert countries, and so that's why we said we bring the money to your country. We own the carbon credits. That's how we pay the contractors and the investors back. And then we have to see how we meet your NDC maybe later on, because the carbon credits, they are basically the project the timeline, of the project are 30 years. So after 30 years, it comes back to your NDC, and you can have that in your NDC. So there are also certain models where we maybe have an exit strategy on certain plots, so they get it earlier back into the NDC. That depends on operation costs, capex, opex at the end. So so there are certain negotiation between the governments, the investors we have, and us.
Thanks, Gabby. Colin, Helga, anything you two would like to add to this as project developers?
I think it comes down to project specificity. You have to work with the regulations in the countries that you are in. You know, our deals in Mozambique are very different in Zambia, necessarily just because of regulation. So I think, yeah, it's certainly something that we need to be very cognizant of, and you need to work very collaboratively. One, as I said right at the beginning, is first with the communities and the land stewards, and second with the governments with which you work. Otherwise, your deals are going to fail, and it's like any other investment across the globe. That's what you have to work with.
Helga?
Yeah, fully in line. I mean, countries are at different stages in thinking through this. I think in the space in which we are in the avoidance, we do explain governments that there needs to be an additionality in activity, and that obviously, first and foremost, that needs to be funded, otherwise there's no credit. And then the second big piece is obviously identifying how do you ensure the benefit sharing mechanism with the communities around it, which is also not always first and foremost on the thoughts of governments.
And that's a very important point. Vienne, anything you would like to add to this?
Just a reflection. The complexity you've just heard, you know, that is what's going to evolve over the next few years in real time. So the purpose of dealing with how one governs this space at a global level is equally complex, exactly as you've alluded to, Michael and Tanya. So how do we start to advocate for frameworks around this? What are the legal rights of nature? What should regulators be doing? What frameworks should they be putting in place for all of us to start to move towards? It's got to be critical.
Thank you. And I mean, I'm delighted to see with our project developers, I would consider all best in class in terms of ticking all those boxes. Michael, I hope that's addressed some of your questions, and happy to pick it up afterwards. Yes, sir.
Well, first, thanks for this wonderful discussion. Really well done and well moderated, very insightful. I still try to push a bit on the solution side, if I may. My name is Dominik Breitinger. I work for Enterprise for Society, which is an academic think tank formed by the three Lausanne universities. And I'm also a blockchain enthusiast. So maybe a question for Colin, because I think is it just fashionable terms, you know, blockchain, crypto, and even NFTs? But when you're about discussing creating a market, maybe you also need crazy solutions on monitoring and traceability. Blockchain might be part of the solution. And yeah, we also observe pilots in the crypto space and NFTs for regeneration projects. Is that something you buy, or is that something you consider being part of the solution, or is that just fashion or buzzwords or flavor of the month?
It's a great question. That we actually piloted a leopard translocation NFT last year, where we had an outcomes pair very similar to the Rhino bond structure, and with certain metrics on delivery of the metrics, the NFT was minted and transferred. So it was effectively, it's a demonstration of value. They acquire the right effectively and get an NFT in return, which is tradable thereafter, which is kind of like a biodiversity credit. The challenge that we faced is, I agree with you, the track and trace function of blockchain is, for me, fundamentally going to be a part of the solution in the future, because it reduces your monitoring and evaluation costs. So that transaction cost we're talking about can be addressed to some extent like that. However, where we had challenges is boards and investors and financial institutions are nervous of, when you say cryptocurrency, immediately the red flags go up and say, oh, we don't know that risk. You know, we had discussions with our auditors, PwC, how do you address this risk? What is your process in place? And it gets really complicated really quickly. So I think to answer the question, NFTs are a whole separate conversation, which I'm not going to get into now, but I think the blockchain tech is hugely valuable, but it requires a lot of buy-in. And as I said earlier, that's just the front end. You know, what are you actually delivering is the question at the end of the day. Are you making biodiversity impact? And this is just a way of packaging it and selling it, and there's many ways to do that.
Thanks, Colin. Any other questions? Cedric?
Hi, I'm Cedric from the ARC, and thank you so much for this valuable conversation you just had. As the first person from the panel, from the audience asked and said, biodiversity is on top of the pyramid. So And if you look at carbon credits, that's really, it's a combination of two atoms, and this is something we can monetize so far. So when we talk about biodiversity credits, it's a very, very long way and hyper complex to somehow calculate how to come to that. And my question is, when do you think we will have biodiversity credits which will address all needs and make it really transparent? From my point of view, this will take a lot of time. And so what's the way to go there? Like, will there be any other asset classes we should have? Because we need some pragmatism to make it more measurable, be it like fauna credits or flora credits. Not sure, but I would like to hear your view on that, because if we do biodiversity credits, somehow emit and create a market with that, I think if we do it too early, it will increase more inequivalencies. So, and yeah, which might create market dynamics which are not the right one. They might go into the wrong direction.
So I mean, I'll quickly respond to this from my perspective, and I think that this was the point of this panel today, is that as promising as the concept of biodiversity credits is, right? And we can all sit with a blank piece of paper and say, oh, look at this, we'll sell biodiversity credits and it'll catalyze investments into nature. I think you're 100% spot on. We have to build this market in a particular way so that it is well functioning in the future. And I think the first audience members' questions pointed to the complexity that exists in carbon markets today that we're battling with. And I think most people will acknowledge that biodiversity is significantly more complex to measure than climate and carbon. So I do think that, personally, I think that we are still a way off a fully fledged biodiversity credits market or even a nature credits market. And I think whatever we are doing, looking to build in this space, we have to be learning from carbon. You know, I think that there is, from some stakeholders, a real willingness for biodiversity to have its own seat at the table. And no one wants that more than me. But that doesn't mean that we should just forget the amazing work that has been done on climate and learn from that climate agenda. I'm going to turn to my panelists. Tanya.
Sorry, yes. I just want to say, there are biodiversity credit markets that have been in existence since like the 1980s in like the US. So there's species and habitat banking, there's wetland mitigation banking, there's also trading of NOx and SOx credits, trading of nitrification credits. So like this kind of has been happening for a long time. It's just happened obviously to address specific issues. And I think you know, that's also coming a bit to Michael's point. I mean, I think the types of stuff that Red Dot Plus is doing under UNFCCC is actually supporting, as far as I understand it, protecting like existing forests that are maybe high deforestation but have low deforestation threats, versus the voluntary carbon markets approaches, which is very much focused on additionality and trying to kind of reduce forests that are under threat. So I think when we think about a market and a market mechanism, I think we have to think about like, what is the issue that we are trying to address, who is going to pay for it, what are the transaction costs on doing that, and then I think we can think about a market. But I think just thinking about the instrument and the market mechanism first without thinking about the underlying is to me quite a huge mistake. And I think we should be looking at some of the existing experiences that have already been happening for decades.
Thanks, Tanya. Gabby?
Yes, well, I think we just recently understood the value of forests. And still the forest management is left over with the forestry industry, more or less. These are the experts who decide on the forest. So in my opinion, I think the whole parameters have to be shifted. We have to rethink actually how we see nature. And I think that's the base before we talk about carbon, biodiversity credits, because the value is not put into the discussion yet. So in my eyes, if you still clear-cut forests and that's still allowed, it's a very contradiction to what we try to achieve. I think we have first to set the parameters right, and then once that is understood and certain regulations are in place, then I think we can discuss how we can enhance that market and add on extra biodiversity credits. So I think the base has to be done first.
Thanks, Gabby. Anyone else on the panel want to address? No, Helga?
Yeah, maybe, I think if you look at a pathway, right, I really would, to some extent, challenge people here to say, let's wait and see on biodiversity credits. I mean, as I said before, I'm not necessarily saying we need to move towards biodiversity credit. I think we need to increase funding into nature, and we need to accelerate putting more funding into nature. And while we may not create that perfect market immediately, there is an opportunity to move on project finance and to get closer towards a market mechanism. So that means we start doing potentially blended finance projects which are outcomes based. That would be a really important step towards moving towards a nature market. And if we don't do that, we're going to find ourselves at some point having a really nice theory, but which is not going to be practical or implementable or cost effective in any ways, and therefore not scalable.
Thanks, Helga. So I'm conscious of time, and unfortunately, no more questions. However, I'm just going to quickly summarize for me a couple of key takeaways. And as we started the session, this idea that, yes, this is a very promising market. It's a concept at this point. I think what's come through very clearly for me today from the panelists is it's a market in the future. We need funding for biodiversity and nature today. And I think this very important point that's come through around the idea of project finance versus a market. And that really talks to the idea that biodiversity is context specific. And that's why I'm so delighted that we've had project developers on the panel today who are reminding us why we are ultimately doing this. We are trying to get more funding into the field, into nature. And I think that is what we should always remind ourselves of. That is the purpose of this. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much to our panelists. You've been outstanding. I hope to the audience this has been an interesting conversation and has stimulated a degree of debate. As we said at the beginning, we do not necessarily believe that this is a silver bullet that's going to solve all our problems. We need to be discussing these kind of topics more openly, and we need to be very careful in managing market expectations that people don't walk away thinking, don't worry, there's biodiversity credits and that's going to solve all our problems, because that solution is still a while away. So with that, to our audience, thank you very, very much for attending. And to our panelists, once again, thank you very, very much for your insights.